Hello and welcome to OnPoint, a podcast by Oak Street Funding where we sit down with industry leaders to bring insights to the topics that you want to hear about. I'm your host today, Alex Weaver, VP of Strategic Markets at Oak Street Funding, and let's get on point. Today I'm joined by Rob Roach. Rob is the Director of Underwriting here at Oak Street Funding, and today we're going to discuss underwriting for M&A. Rob, thank you for joining me.
Alex, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and ready to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start, what are you seeing as kind of some emerging trends from an underwriter's perspective in M&A deals?
I think some of the emerging trends that we're all seeing are, increased multiples as we've had some other entities and other people get involved in a lot of these M&A transactions. And so what that's had the effect of, along with decreasing interest rates, are really increased multiples and driving values higher. We're seeing, as we get into the fourth quarter, especially a sense of urgency for people that are looking to get transactions closed by the end of the year. And, and on that, really two types of buyers. We have that strategic buyer that is looking for a firm that maybe, somehow complements their business, whether it's from an employee perspective, picking up some additional talent, or has maybe some additional product offerings they currently don't have. And so we're seeing some of those, and just as well as, folks that are just increasing their asset base, looking to grow that business. So we're seeing those things. And again, it's always a competitive environment. So seeing a lot of competition for deals.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think that's, some good insight for people as they're kind of looking to get things in Q4 and Q1 of this year. So give us a little bit of a breakdown of how an underwriter typically, works in the context of an M&A deal for a buyer.
Yeah, very complex transactions, that we're looking at. Especially when you get any kind of an acquisition, it could be a complex transaction, regardless of the size, because you have two entities that are really coming in, and integrating themselves together. And so, the first part of, when we're looking at underwriting a transaction really is why this transaction is going to work. That's really the first thing that we're working with along with the buyer and the seller, right? Why is this transaction valuable? Why does it increase value for your firm? And so, we're evaluating that merger. We're looking at, how it's structured. We're looking at that asset purchase agreement or that stock purchase agreement. How much of it's going to be upfront, how much is going to be followed up in some kind of seller payment or seller note, those type of things. And really, evaluating those with, how Oak Street can really help in financing those. And so the underwriters really working to put all that together and form, along with the salesperson, what's the best solution for our clients in making this acquisition from a financing perspective, and what gives us and our clients the best chance of success.
Yeah, and making sure they're insulated from risk so that,
Right.
It makes sure they're successful long term as well. So going kind of along with that, what are, would you say, the most common red flags that you tend to see with these transactions that, could kind of lead to them falling apart?
Yeah, some of our common red flags that we see, number one, lack of preparedness. We have people that when we ask, why does this transaction make sense for you? A lot of times, well, it's going to increase my revenue. Okay, great. How's it going to increase our revenue? How is it going to improve your business? How are you going to integrate these things? Because that's a big part of it, is understanding how a firm is going to integrate these transactions. And so, if I get a sense that, the owner really hasn't thought through that process much, really hasn't thought how they're going to integrate this, or maybe they haven't even thought about how they're going to finance it yet. Mm-hmm. Those are some red flags for me. I think the opposite, not the opposite, the other side of it, with the seller is understanding what the seller's role is going to be after the transaction. Mm-hmm. Where we see issues a lot of times, it's because the seller and the buyer, maybe they're not on the same page exactly. So we're always looking to see, how can we form that alignment between the buyer and the seller? Everybody wants to see this succeed. And so, those are some red flags that we look at if we, notice that the buyer and seller, aren't on the same page, especially if the seller is going to remain engaged in the business. Mm-hmm. And so those are the things we're looking at.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so kind of going along that, what do you think people can do proactively to kind of prepare themselves for these transactions and make sure they're kind of set up for success?
One of the things that I think is very important is, making sure before you start a project like this, before you start looking for acquisitions, is making sure that your shop is in order. And that can kind of go with the red flag as well. When we see someone who's making an acquisition, maybe you're not making money yet, and maybe you don't have, surplus cash built up for the just in case things. How we're going to deal with those items, making sure that you're prepared, your institution, to make that acquisition, so that you're prepared to go into a situation where there's going to be some unknowns. Not everything's going to go exactly right. Not everything's going to do exactly, go exactly how you think it's going to go. There's going to be a hiccup somewhere, and those hiccups could be anything from you have a large client that leaves. You have a producer that maybe is coming over with the firm that decides not to come over, and maybe there's some issues around that. So there's going to be some things that you can't know up front everything.
Yeah.
And so it's how you're going to deal with that. And so making sure that your business is in the best shape that it can be in before you start making acquisitions, I think is very important, and something that a lot of people can, it's a great exercise to go through, especially when you're making an acquisition.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it definitely makes sense to kind of get your shop in order and make sure that everything's aligned so that you can do those transactions that you're ready to do. So going off of that a little bit, when we're looking at kind of the three industries you work with, so insurance, wealth advisors, CPA, are there any industry specific things that you've been seeing in terms of, that are influencing underwriting decisions right now in M&A deals?
Yeah, one of the things I think everybody's seeing is the increasing role that private equity is playing in any transaction. We're seeing a lot of private equity firms come in and either make acquisitions or being a part of some acquisition. And so, we're seeing those in pretty much every one of our verticals. We're seeing multiples that maybe are a little different depending on the vertical. And so we're looking at that. The RIAs are still kind of a building business to where, where those multiples end up, we're still guessing to go where those are going to go. But, and with market fluctuations and watching all those things, but those are the things that we're really seeing in those industries.
Gotcha. So Rob, how does the underwriter typically collaborate with the different teams across Oak Street?
Yeah, I think, the underwriter in a transaction, especially an acquisition, and not just the underwriter, but the legal, servicing, or sales team, all have to really work together to make sure everybody stays on the same page. And making sure our clients and our sellers stay on the same page.
Yeah.
And so, the underwriter works with our sales team up front, making sure that as we structure the acquisition, the financing for that we're all on the same page regarding it, as well as our client. How is best to do it? Best for Oak Street, best for our client. How can we work best to make sure that everybody's successful there? The second thing is to make sure that our legal team and underwriting teams are working together. And as they're putting together our loan documentation, as we're putting together the covenant definitions, all this stuff, making sure that everybody stays on the same page. And so kind of quarterbacking that process a little bit, and working with our client to make sure they're still in the loop. And so we want to make sure that communication stays very open during the time. Just because we want to make sure that people who make money on this isn't just the attorneys.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that, our clients are making money, the seller's getting paid what they should. And so, it's making sure that we can all stay on the same page, all stay focused on the closing and moving it forward. And so, that's an important role that we play in making sure that, everything lines up the way it should.
Yeah, and obviously, as an organization that services all of our loans too, making sure that relationship is strong, because we're going to be with you through the entirety of your loan. So,
absolutely.
So when our listeners, I'm sure they'd probably appreciate some tips as they're looking across kind of our three verticals. So, insurance, CPAs, and wealth advisors. What are you seeing in any of those specific industries that maybe are more specific to a particular vertical?
Right. One of the things, we're seeing, different multiple valuations. Some industries, the multiples seem to be settling a little bit, and others, the multiples are still ever increasing, it seems like. And so, a lot of that's being driven by, private equity coming into pretty much every vertical. Private equity kind of makes things a little bit different for everyone. And, I would just stress one of the things, we always want to make sure is if you're going to go with a private equity group, make sure you get the right one, because there's different firms, they have, different goals in mind. And we talked about alignment earlier. We want to make sure that everybody has alignment. And so, especially when we bring in a partner that's on the private equity side. And so really, the trends are really the multiples. And again, the speed of the acquisitions. We're seeing acquisitions, in the RIA vertical that seem to be more and more all the time.
Yeah.
Bigger and bigger. And so making sure, that we're tracking those. In the insurance and the CPA, we're still seeing a lot of acquisitions due to a lot of the this probably might be unpopular. Some aging of the folks that are the principals of these firms. So we talk about what's next for our CPA clients. Well, what's your next step? And is it selling internally? Is it selling externally? Merging? How those are going to be. So those are all trends that we continue to see.
Yeah, I know, and it is really so different across all the verticals as they're kind of having their different timelines and booms across those. So I think for our listeners, it would be really helpful for us to understand, what kind of the most challenging transactions you typically see are, or if there's a specific one that maybe had a difficult structure or things like that, what that kind of looked like.
Yeah, some of the most difficult transactions, and we actually call some of our clients serial acquirers, and it's not breakfast cereal, but serial acquirers, folks that have acquired a pretty rapid pace, and so those can be a little bit challenging because as the firm grows, we're trying to track financial performance, we're trying to track how you're integrating these acquisitions, and sometimes that can be a challenge if we're making 5, 6 acquisitions a year. And so, those are challenging, from an underwriting perspective, just because we want to see how they're all going. And sometimes it's still too new. And so, that's where, we talked about having your shop in order before we start doing that. Before we start acquiring, those are the things that help us because maybe we have the back office, we have the support to show, okay, we're keeping kind of financially these separate so we can monitor each acquisition separately and tell you, okay, this one's going well, this one's having some challenges, and here's why. So those are kind of a challenging situation. I think add backs, right? And everybody wants to add back on an acquisition, and sometimes we'll sit and we'll see, the pro forma earnings are 2 times what the historicals were because we're adding a lot back. And so as an underwriter, it sometimes can be challenging to figure out, what's going to really come through as an add back and what really isn't. Because, again, we talked about things aren't going to go exactly how we thought they were. So maybe we eliminated this expense, or we thought we were going to be able to eliminate this expense. And moving forward, we find out, we really can't, or we have to replace it with something else. There's a person we thought we could do without, but we just had to hire somebody that maybe he gets paid more than the person we eliminated it. Yeah. And so it's really figuring those type of things out. So when there's a large pro forma number, that's one of the things, we really ask our client to help us with in terms of how are you coming up with this number? How are we going to support it? And why do we think this pro forma number is right? Because that pro forma number, we're not only basing our cash flow on that number, we're also basing a lot of the sales price on that number. And so we want to make sure, our client is paying an appropriate amount because as a seller, and I would be the one to include, I'd be like, hey, everything's added back. Because I want that price to be as high as I can get it. Yeah. And so it's really going through with our clients to make sure what's an appropriate level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to kind of insulate the risk of the client and make sure that they're, set up for success. So to wrap up, to kind of give the, listeners a good warm-hearted feeling, what are kind of some big success stories that we've had that you can remember from our space?
Yeah, we've had, several instances of clients that have started with us that, had the goal of making acquisitions in mind. And maybe they didn't have a target up front. Maybe they weren't maybe they weren't even thinking about it at the time when they became a client of ours. And we've really, helped them grow. We've had, several examples where, a client maybe picks up a firm that's similar to them. Maybe it's a strategic acquisition. And, the ball starts rolling. And when the ball starts rolling, once we're comfortable with you as a client, comfortable from an underwriting perspective means, we've kind of done our due diligence on your company. We kind of know how you've done. We have all the historical stuff is kind of completed. And so we're really looking at, what things look like going forward. And so, we have clients that we have tripled, quadrupled in size. I think our best success stories are where we've had clients that have built their firms to the part where they have a liquidity event. Not so good for us, but good for our client where, they've worked their career to build something and now it's time for them to have the liquidity event. And so, maybe it was making those acquisitions to get to a certain size where, all of a sudden the multiples get bigger, or maybe, that you start hitting that number that you have in mind. Because, ultimately there's going to be somebody that probably will pay that right now. And so it's just, those are our true success stories where, If it's maybe you have it through, you can pass down a successful company to your second generation, your employees, or you have that liquidity you met personally. Those are our big success stories.
Yeah, no, I think that's great to kind of show people what the end goal is and how we can kind of be a stepping stone for that. Well, Rob, thank you very much. I think, myself and my listeners obviously learned a lot about, how to set themselves up for success and obviously things to avoid as well while they're going through M&A. So I think it was very informative.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all for listening to OnPoint, a podcast by Oak Street Funding. I'm Alex Weaver, and tune in next time wherever you listen to your podcasts as we get on point. Don't forget to rate and review on Spotify, like and subscribe on YouTube, and follow us on Instagram at onpoint.with.osf. See you next time.